Well, joining me now from Seattle, Washington is Tobin. He is a professor and director of the Pacific Northwest Seismic Network, an earthquake and volcanic activity tracking center jointly operated by the University of Washington and the University of Oregon. Professor, great to have you on with us. I want to ask you first about these large aftershocks that we saw Monday in Turkey, 2 weeks after these initial major earthquakes. Is it reasonable to expect that this region could continue to see other large aftershocks of similar or perhaps even greater magnitude for quite some time?
Yeah, thank you for having me. And my heart goes out to the people still suffering from the after effects. Unfortunately, I have to say that aftershocks remain a possibility. It's quite normal after any large earthquake to see aftershocks over time. At first, very frequently, as people saw in the immediate hours and first couple of days. And then they diminish with time, fortunately, but that doesn't mean we can't have aftershocks as large as magnitude 6 or greater, even potentially, although with low probability, as high as magnitude 7 or greater in the coming days, weeks, and even months. Aftershocks after a large earthquake are just a normal part of the process, unfortunately.
These original two major earthquakes caused ruptures that stretch for hundreds of kilometers in the surface of the Earth, where the land moved up to 7 meters in opposite directions. Can you explain to us why that was and the significance of that?
Yeah, the ruptures that we see at the surface are the manifestation of the fault line across which the Earth's crust moved. So we feel the shaking from the earthquake, but the shaking comes from the slip of one side of the rock against the other side along one of these fault lines. For a smaller earthquake, the fault is shorter, and other things being equal, for a very large earthquake, the fault is very long. So in this case, several hundred kilometers of fault length is all the parts of the fault that actually slipped in the initial pair of very large earthquakes. And what we're seeing with aftershocks is they slip a piece of that same fault or of nearby and adjacent faults because after the main earthquake, there's still sort of stress that is left behind and unresolved in the Earth, and it needs to kind of almost settle into its new position. So one of the reasons why we see a very active series of aftershocks for these particular earthquakes is because they did affect such a long length of fault zone along the East Anatolian Fault and the connected faults.
Professor, I'm wondering why it's so difficult to predict when and where earthquakes will happen, because we do know that this region of Turkey is prone to earthquakes. I grew up in Seattle, where you're from, and they've been saying for years that Seattle is expected to have a major earthquake, but yet we can't predict when it will actually happen. Why is it so difficult to still predict earthquakes, even though we know where they're more likely to occur?
Yes, it's really one of the toughest problems in the earth sciences. And the reason is because we can understand which faults are building up the stresses that create an earthquake. And that's why we can make a long range forecast, for example, to say that a particular fault has a high probability of earthquakes. But an earthquake is due to all that stress building along the fault, but it begins by the stress exceeding at some location, somewhere probably quite small, down deep in the fault zone, many kilometers below the surface. Exceeding the ability of the fault to resist it. And then the break, the rupture, spreads out from that area. So predicting the exact spot on a very large fault where that first break will take place is really difficult. In fact, it's impossible. And so that also means that predicting the exact timing. We're just up against the geological forces that build up slowly over decades or hundreds of years, but release in a matter of seconds to minutes.
All right, we'll leave it there. Tobin joining us from Seattle. Thank you.
Thank you for having me today.